Dawn on February 20, 1945 over the volcanic island of Iwo Jima was marked by the appearance of a new, terrifying weapon of war. As the first rays of the sun illuminated the black volcanic sand of the beaches, American Sherman tanks began a slow, methodical advance towards the Japanese defensive positions. But these were not ordinary tanks. Instead of traditional guns, they carried flamethrowers capable of spewing streams of burning napalm at a distance of several tens of meters. What happened that day forever changed the perception of modern warfare and became one of the most dramatic pages in the history of the battle for Iwo Jima. The Japanese defenders of the island, battle-hardened veterans of the Imperial Army, considered themselves ready for any challenge. They had survived months of continuous bombardment, withstood artillery bombardment of such force that it seemed as if the island itself was about to split in half. They hid deep underground, in a maze of tunnels and bunkers, from where they planned to make every meter of the Americans' advance unbearably expensive. But nothing could have prepared them for the flamethrower tanks. When the first tank opened fire, a blinding stream of flame burst from its turret, enveloping the Japanese pillbox in a thick orange cloud. Napalm, a sticky, jelly-like substance based on gasoline, stuck to everything it touched, turning concrete fortifications into hellish furnaces. The temperature inside the pillboxes rose to inhuman levels in a matter of seconds. The defenders, who did not die instantly from burns, suffocated from lack of oxygen, which was consumed by the raging flames. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers, ready to fight to their last breath against machine guns and artillery, were defenseless against this new, terrifying weapon. The birth of a secret weapon at Schofield Barracks. The story of the flame-throwing tanks that played a crucial role on Iwo Jima began a few months before the landing, in the tropical heat of Hawaii. At the Schofield Barracks, located in the central part of the island of Oahu, a group of military engineers and technicians worked in the strictest secrecy on a project that could change the course of the Pacific War. The command of the U.S. Navy has long been aware of the problem faced by the Marines when capturing fortified Japanese positions on the Pacific Islands. Traditional methods of dealing with pillboxes and bunkers, artillery shelling, aerial bombing, tank attacks, proved ineffective against well-designed and deeply buried fortifications. The command of the U.S. Navy has long been aware of the problem faced by the Marines when capturing fortified Japanese positions on thick islands. Traditional methods of dealing with pillboxes and bunkers, artillery shelling, aerial bombing, tank attacks, proved ineffective against well-designed and deeply buried fortifications. Portable flamethrowers proved their effectiveness, but the cost of using them was monstrous. Flamethrower operators became priority targets for Japanese snipers and machine gunners, and losses among them reached 70%, and in some operations, 92%. Solving this problem required a non-standard approach. Colonel George Unmacked, an experienced tank officer with a keen engineering mind, has assembled a unique team of specialists. It included Ching. This problem required a non-standard approach. Colonel George Unmacked, an experienced tank officer with a keen engineering mind, has assembled a unique team of specialists. It included chemists from the military laboratory, engineers from the Naval Construction Battalion, the famous Seabees, Marine Corps tankers, and artillery company specialists. It was a real interdisciplinary project that combined expertise from various fields of military science. The technical management of the project fell on the shoulders of two outstanding specialists, Assistant Engineer Riker and Assistant Electrician Joseph Kissel. These people had not only deep technical knowledge, but also practical experience working with heavy military equipment in combat conditions. They had to solve the most difficult engineering task, to create a combat vehicle that would combine the destructive power of a flamethrower with the security and maneuverability of a medium tank. The work was carried out around the clock. In the tropical heat, with humidity that turned every movement into a test, engineers and technicians worked on prototypes, tested various configurations, and analyzed the results of field tests. The secrecy of the project was absolute. Even many Marine Corps officers did not know about the existence of flame-throwing tanks until their appearance on Iwo Jima. Technical experiments and initial failures. The first attempts to create a flame-throwing tank were based on the use of light tanks M3. These small, maneuverable vehicles seemed ideal candidates for installing flamethrower equipment. However, it soon became clear that this solution had serious drawbacks that made it unsuitable for use in the Pacific theater of operations. The main problem was the limited angle of rotation of the tower. The flamethrower installed in the M3 turret could not provide a sufficient firing range. The Unmacked team was faced with the need to find a new platform. After a thorough analysis of all available options, the choice fell on the M4 Sherman medium tank, the workhorse of the American tank forces, which has proven itself in all theaters of military operations. The Sherman had exactly the combination of characteristics required for the project: thick enough armor to protect against most Japanese anti-tank weapons, a reliable engine capable of carrying the additional weight of flamethrower equipment, and, importantly, a spacious interior space to accommodate fuel tanks and hydraulic systems. Thus began the process of creating what would later be designated the CBH-1, the first ever flame-throwing tank based on a medium tank. It was an ambitious task that required not only installing a flamethrower on a tank, but also a comprehensive redesign of the entire internal layout of the vehicle, the creation of new safety and fire control systems. The creation of the CBH-1, an engineering masterpiece of wartime. The development of the CBH-1 flame-throwing tank was a true triumph of American military engineering. The creators faced a task that seemed almost impossible: to turn an ordinary Sherman tank into an effective flamethrower weapon without sacrificing its security and maneuverability, and, most importantly, to ensure the safety of the crew when working with a huge amount of flammable fuel. The key decision was to replace the tank's main 75mm cannon with a flamethrower launcher. It was a radical step. The tank lost its main anti-tank weapon, becoming a highly specialized machine for fighting fortifications. However, the advantages of this solution were obvious. Using the gun's location made it possible to provide the flamethrower with a full 270-degree turn and an elevation angle from -10 to +35 degrees. The gunner could aim a flamethrower weapon with the same accuracy as a conventional cannon using a standard tank periscope and familiar controls. The fuel system was developed with the utmost care. The main fuel tanks contained 290 gallons of thickened napalm fuel, a thick jelly-like gasoline-based mixture that stuck to any surface and burned at temperatures capable of melting steel. Additionally, the system contained 10 gallons of non-charged fuel, which was used to ignite the bulk of the napalm when fired. This two-component system ensured reliable ignition and stable combustion of the mixture in all weather conditions. But the presence of almost 300 gallons of flammable material inside the tank posed an obvious threat to the crew. A single hit by a Japanese shell into the fuel tank could turn the tank into a fiery grave for his team. The engineers developed a solution to this problem. A separate pressure tank was filled with compressed nitrogen. Nitrogen is an inert gas that does not support combustion. Even if the projectile penetrated this tank, the nitrogen simply escaped, without creating a risk of explosion or fire. A nitrogen-based pressure system pushed the napalm through the flamethrower, while providing an additional layer of safety. The flamethrower system could maintain continuous fire for 80 seconds, enough time to completely empty the fuel tanks. However, in combat conditions, it was recommended to use short flashes lasting 2 to 3 seconds. This firing mode allowed the crew to effectively use the fuel supply, hitting multiple targets instead of using up all the napalm in one position. Short flashes were also more psychologically effective. Sudden bursts of flame gave the enemy the impression that the tank had an unlimited supply of fire mixture. Externally, the modified tanks were no different from ordinary Shermans. They were painted in the standard olive gray color of the Marine Corps. It was an elaborate camouflage. Japanese observers and gunners could not distinguish a flamethrower tank from a conventional one until the moment when it opened fire. This tactical trick made it impossible for the enemy to concentrate fire on the most dangerous targets in advance. Iwo Jima, a fortress in the ocean. While American engineers were working on developing new weapons at Schofield Barracks, the Japanese military was building one of the most impregnable fortresses in the history of modern warfare on a small volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean. Iwo Jima, an octagonal piece of frozen lava measuring only 8 kilometers long and 4 wide, was supposed to be the place where the American offensive would drown in blood. The command of the island's defense was entrusted to General Kuribayashi, one of the most talented and far-sighted Japanese military leaders. Kuribayashi, unlike many of his colleagues, had no illusions about the possibility of winning the war with the United States. He spent several years in America before the war, served as a military attaché, and was well aware of the scale of the enemy's industrial might. But if victory was impossible, then it could be made so expensive that the Americans would think about the price of continuing the war. Kuribayashi abandoned the traditional Japanese tactics of coastal defense followed by massive counterattacks. The experience of previous battles on the Pacific Islands has shown that such tactics simply play into the hands of the Americans with their overwhelming superiority in artillery and aviation. Instead, the general developed a completely new defensive concept based on deep echelon defense and maximum use of underground fortifications. The heart of this system was a network of tunnels that had no analogues in military history. Japanese engineers, working in inhumane conditions, in stifling heat, with the constant threat of landslides and in an atmosphere saturated with sulfur fumes from volcanic crevasses, laid 11 miles of underground utilities. The original plan called for the creation of 17 miles of tunnels, but continuous American bombing and lack of time did not allow the construction to be completed in full. These tunnels were not primitive shelters. It was a real underground fortress, designed with engineering precision. Some underground rooms could accommodate up to 400 people. The ventilation shaft system provided air circulation even at the deepest levels. There were full-fledged hospitals with operating rooms, communication centers equipped with modern equipment at that time, and extensive storage facilities for ammunition, food, and water. Tunnels connected all the key defensive positions, allowing Japanese troops to move stealthily throughout the island, appearing where they were least expected. Kuribayashi distributed his forces with mathematical precision. The southern sector of the island, which included the beachheads where the Americans were to land, was assigned to Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi. The northern plateau, where Mount Suribachi towered, an extinct volcano that dominated the island's landscape, was under the direct command of Kuribayashi himself. The Central Reserve, located deep inside the island, could quickly reinforce any threatened sector through a tunnel system. Each defensive position was positioned according to precise mathematical calculations. The affected areas of the various firing points overlapped at certain angles, creating a multi-layered fire system from which there were no safe paths. Artillery spotters had spotted all the key points of the island in advance and could call fire on any coordinate grid within a few seconds. The machine gun nests were positioned so that they could not just fire at the advancing enemy, but direct his movement towards pre-registered artillery targets, where American troops came under concentrated fire from heavy guns. Kuribayashi's defensive philosophy was simple and ruthless: save ammunition, avoid senseless suicidal attacks, and hold every position to the last man. Every Japanese soldier on Iwo Jima had to kill 10 Americans before dying himself. It wasn't just military planning, it was the mathematics of desperation, an attempt to turn an inevitable defeat into a disaster for the victor. American bombing, the illusion of destruction. The American command was well aware that Iwo Jima would become a hard nut. A few months before the planned landing, an aerial bombing campaign began, designed to soften the Japanese defenses. B-24 and B-29 heavy bombers dropped tons of explosives on the small island day after day. It seemed that no living being could survive under such a hail of fire and steel. But the underground fortress of Kuribayashi turned out to be practically invulnerable to air attacks. Even the heaviest bombs could rarely penetrate deep enough to damage tunnels and underground fortifications. The surface pillboxes and bunkers, of course, suffered from bombing, but Japanese engineers quickly repaired the damage, using underground utilities to deliver materials and work crews. Post-operative analysis revealed the shocking truth: months of intense bombing destroyed less than 20% of the enemy's fortified positions. The tunnel system has remained virtually intact. American pilots reported the complete destruction of the defenses, but the reality turned out to be completely different. The Japanese defenders patiently waited out the bombardment in the depths of their underground shelters, and then returned to their combat positions, ready to meet the enemy with fire. It was then that Colonel George Wehrmacht and his team received the green light to deploy flame-throwing tanks. Traditional methods of dealing with Japanese fortifications clearly did not work. Weapons were needed that could penetrate where bombs and artillery shells could not reach, inside concrete pillboxes and underground fortifications. Landing on Iwo Jima, flame-throwing tanks entered the battle. On February 19, 1945, Operation Detachment began, the code name for the landing on Iwo Jima. The first waves of the landing force encountered something no one expected: a deadening silence. Japanese troops, following Kuribayashi's orders, did not open fire on the landing craft and the first waves of Marines. The Americans landed almost without resistance, which caused the veterans of the Pacific Campaign an uneasy feeling. They knew that this was the calm before the storm. 8 M4 Sherman tanks, 4 Type A tanks and 3 CBH-1 flame-throwing tanks were brought ashore as part of the landing. These vehicles were carefully distributed among the units. 4 were transferred to the 4th Marine Division, and 4 more were transferred to the 5th Division. Each tank was assigned an identification number, although most of them had no other identification marks. This was done on purpose so as not to distinguish them from ordinary tanks. For the first 24 hours, flamethrower tanks stood idle near the beach. This was not a mistake or indecision of the command, it was a well-thought-out tactic. The American officers wanted to keep the secret of the new weapon until the moment when its use would bring maximum effect. Meanwhile, conventional tanks and infantry fought heavy battles for the bridgehead, suffering significant losses from well-camouflaged Japanese gun emplacements. On February 20th, the flame-throwing tanks finally entered the battle. The first target was a series of Japanese pillboxes blocking the advance of the Marines in the southern sector. When the first flame-throwing tank entered the position and opened fire, the effect exceeded all expectations. A jet of burning napalm, stretching for several tens of meters, enveloped the Japanese fortifications. Thick orange fire penetrated the embrasures, flooded the trenches, turning them into hellish corridors of flame. The Japanese soldiers, who had survived months of bombing and sustained incredible artillery fire, could not resist the flamethrowers. Those defenders who did not die from burns or suffocation fled their positions in a panic, becoming an easy target for American shooters. The psychological effect was devastating. There was no protection against the flames, neither courage, nor fortitude, nor readiness for death helped. The commander of the Marine Battalion, who observed the actions of the flame-throwing tanks, later called them the best weapon in the entire operation to capture Iwo Jima. This was no exaggeration. Flame-throwing tanks solved tasks that took hours of bloody fighting for ordinary infantry and tanks in a matter of minutes. Corkscrew and Gorenji tactics, the art of fire warfare. As the fighting continued, the crews of flame-throwing tanks developed and improved their tactics. One of the most effective techniques was a maneuver called corkscrew and Gorenji. Its essence was that the tank was approaching the target not in a straight line, but moving in a spiral, constantly changing direction and speed. This tactic solved several problems at once. Firstly, it made it difficult for Japanese gunners and anti-tank cannon crews, who found it difficult to fire accurately at a constantly maneuvering target. Japanese gunners detected the coordinates of American tanks in advance, but a tank moving in a spiral was rarely where it was expected to be found. Secondly, the spiral movement allowed the crew to inspect the area from all sides, identifying camouflaged firing points before they could open fire. Having reached the optimal distance, usually it was 20 to 30 meters from the target, the tank stopped, and the gunner fired an accurate shot from a flamethrower. A short, 2 to 3 second burst of flame was enough to envelop a pillbox or bunker with napalm. Then the tank either immediately changed position, or gave the Marine sappers the opportunity to approach the target and complete its destruction with explosive charges. Tank number 437, commanded by a sergeant whose name, unfortunately, has not been preserved in historical records, perfected this tactic. His crew worked out a clear sequence of actions. After hitting the target with a flamethrower, the tank took up a defensive position, covering Marine engineers who approached the still smoking fortification and completed its destruction. This combination of the firepower of the tank and the engineering expertise of the sappers made it possible to quickly and effectively neutralize even the strongest fortifications. But the true psychological impact of flame-throwing tanks was demonstrated by tank number 432 under the command of Sergeant William Patterson. On one of the days of fighting, this tank approached the Japanese defensive sector, which was held by an entire company of enemy soldiers. Instead of firing for a long time, Patterson ordered one short burst of flame in the direction of the nearest pillbox. The fire did not reach the target, the distance was too great, and most of the napalm fell to the ground without causing direct damage to the enemy. But the psychological effect was amazing. The Japanese soldiers, who saw what happened to their comrades in other sectors and knew what the appearance of tanks with flamethrowers meant, panicked. A massive, uncontrolled retreat began. The soldiers left their well-fortified positions without waiting for a direct attack. In 30 minutes, the entire defensive sector collapsed, and Patterson's tank did not fire a single direct shot at the enemy after that demonstration flare. The U.S. Marine Corps quickly adapted its tactics to the emergence of a formidable new force on the battlefield, flame-throwing tanks. The infantry units followed at a distance of 50 yards behind the armored vehicles, carefully avoiding the heat shock zone created by the powerful jets of flame. This tactic not only ensured the safety of the soldiers, but also allowed them to instantly occupy positions cleared by flamethrowers from the enemy. Artillery observers, quickly realizing the potential of the new weapon, began specifically marking targets for flamethrower attacks, which significantly increased the effectiveness of coordination on the battlefield. General Kuribayashi, the commander of Japanese forces on Iwo Jima, immediately identified flamethrowing tanks as priority targets. He understood that these machines posed a mortal threat to his defensive strategy based on the use of fortified bunkers and tunnel complexes. However, the Japanese gunners faced a serious problem. They could not effectively identify priority targets until they opened fire. By that time, American tanks had already managed to inflict significant damage. Moreover, the focus on flame-throwing tanks led to the fact that conventional tanks providing cover were left without proper attention and could destroy Japanese anti-tank positions unhindered. The 3rd Marine Division made a determined attempt to capture Hill 382, a strategically important point, riddled with numerous bunkers and connected by a network of underground tunnels. The Japanese defenders, well prepared for defense, recorded the approach of American artillery and mortars in advance, which allowed them to hide until the moment of direct attack. Flame-throwing tanks aimed at breaking through this defense encountered concentrated fire from Japanese mountain guns specially placed to combat armored vehicles. The decisive breakthrough came thanks to the observation of Corporal Michael Rodriguez, who noticed that the steel plates of Japanese bunkers begin to deform with prolonged contact with flames. This discovery led to a change in the tactics of using flamethrowers. Now they concentrated fire on one point for a long time. As a result, the incendiary mixture began to penetrate through the gaps formed, completely destroying the bunkers from the inside. Thanks to these innovative tactics, the Marines were able to break through the external defenses of Hill 382 in just 3 hours, a task that, using traditional methods, could have taken days or weeks. Despite their high efficiency, flamethrower tanks had significant limitations. Tank number 431 completely exhausted its fuel supply after 80 seconds of continuous operation of the flamethrower. It took at least 2 hours to fully refuel, which gave the Japanese defenders valuable time to regroup and strengthen their positions. Under these conditions, portable flamethrowers continued to play an important tactical role, complementing the capabilities of tanks in situations requiring immediate response. With the advance of American forces, the battle shifted to the northern plateau of Iwo Jima, an area with a truly hellish landscape consisting of volcanic formations, deep crevices and almost insurmountable natural obstacles. Under these conditions, flame-throwing tanks have demonstrated exceptional adaptability, turning from a tactical means of support into the main striking force. Major Foster, the commander of the tank battalion, demonstrated tactical ingenuity by ordering one of the flame-throwing tanks to be mounted on a pile of rubble formed after intense bombing. This improvised elevation provided Gunner Corporal Anthony Vitelli with an excellent position to use a flamethrower. When he activated the mechanism, a stream of burning napalm rained down on the Japanese positions with devastating effect. The physical damage was enormous, but the psychological effect was no less significant. Many panicked Japanese soldiers preferred to jump off cliffs just to avoid a painful death in flames. The integration of flame-throwing tanks into the overall tactical scheme has become a real revolution in military affairs. Conventional tanks were used to suppress anti-tank guns and machine gun nests, while infantry provided protection from Japanese suicide bombers trying to attack tanks with explosives. Sappers performed the critical task of clearing obstacles and clearing mines, while ammunition carriers ensured the advance of fuel trailers for refueling flamethrowers. This integrated combat system has had a profound impact on Marine Corps doctrine, forming the basis for future tactical developments. Maintaining the functioning of flame-throwing tanks required the creation of a complex and efficient supply system. The fuel supply chain stretched across the Pacific Ocean to Pearl Harbor, where the main logistics centers were set up. Fuel mixing stations were operating around the clock, mixing diesel fuel, gasoline and napalm powder into a deadly combination. Japanese commanders, realizing the threat, formed special teams to destroy tanks, but their tactics, based on the self-sacrifice of individual soldiers, proved ineffective against the well-integrated defense system of American armored units. General Kuribayashi, despite his determination to hold the island to the last soldier, was forced to admit the crushing effectiveness of flame-throwing tanks. In one of his last reports to Tokyo, he wrote that these machines proved to be more destructive than artillery and aerial bombardment combined. Even flame-throwing tanks damaged in battle were often able to be restored right on the battlefield thanks to the dedicated work of repair crews, which allowed them to return to service and continue performing combat missions. The decisive moment in the battle came when the Marines launched an assault on the gorge, the last stronghold of General Kuribayashi. On March 21, 1945, all serviceable flame-throwing tanks were concentrated for a coordinated attack on an unprecedented scale. The assault began at exactly 10 a.m., when the tanks moved forward in a crescent-shaped formation, creating overlapping fields of fire that left the Japanese defenders no chance of survival. Despite the hopelessness of the situation, the Japanese soldiers continued to resist with fanatical determination. Suicide squads attacked from hidden underground tunnels, but were instantly destroyed by jets of flame. The anti-tank guns fired directly, and their crews continued to fight even as flames engulfed their positions. This desperate bravery, however, could not withstand the overwhelming technological superiority of the American forces. The crews of flame-throwing tanks reported serious psychological injuries sustained during the fighting. The sight of people engulfed in flames left an indelible mark on the minds of even the most seasoned veterans. Repair crews often found human remains literally fused into the tracks and hulls of tanks. The machines themselves were also subjected to extreme loads, transmissions failed due to operation in conditions of abrasive volcanic ash, and flamethrower systems required constant maintenance to maintain combat capability. The Battle of Iwo Jima clearly demonstrated the exceptional effectiveness of flame-throwing tanks. According to military analysts, they destroyed more than 1,000 fortified positions and radically changed the tactical doctrine of the Marine Corps. Captain Frank Caldwell, commander of a company of flame-throwing tanks, noted in his report that it was this weapon, more than any other, that ensured victory in the battle for Iwo Jima. Statistics confirmed his words. More than 30% of the total number of Japanese losses on the island were caused by the use of flamethrower weapons. The tactical consequences of the introduction of flame-throwing tanks were impressive. In the sectors where they were used, the rate of advance of American troops increased by 300% compared to areas where only traditional methods of combat were used. Realizing the potential of the new weapon, the Marine Corps Command requested the production of an additional 54 flame-throwing tanks for use in future operations against Japanese forces. Inspired by the success of the first models, Colonel Unmack's team developed an improved version of the CBH-2, which had an increased range and increased reliability in combat conditions. By June 1945, the American industry had managed to produce 70 new flame-throwing tanks ready to participate in the planned Operation Downfall, a large-scale invasion of the Japanese islands. Army flamethrower tanks capable of releasing up to 200 gallons of combustible mixture in a single attack have demonstrated high effectiveness against Japanese cave complexes in Okinawa. The traditional Japanese military doctrine, which relied on fortified positions and fanatical defense, proved powerless against the technological innovations introduced by the American armed forces. The industrial potential of the United States has played a key role in ensuring the success of flamethrower operations. During the war, Colonel Unmack's group produced 354 flame-throwing tanks and more than 226,000 gallons of specialized fuel. The napalm mixing plants, operating at the limit of their capabilities, produced up to 1 million gallons per day, which allowed American troops to literally burn their way through Japanese defensive lines. This was a prime example of how industrial superiority transformed into a tactical advantage on the battlefield. The psychological consequences of serving in flamethrower tank crews were severe and long-lasting. Many tankers suffered from symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, compounded by awareness of the nature of the weapons they were operating. Sergeant Metzger, a veteran of tank battles, admitted shortly before his death in the 1980s that, despite the psychological damage inflicted on the crews, flame-throwing tanks saved countless lives of American Marines. After the war, veterans of the flame-throwing units created an informal network of mutual support to help them cope with traumatic memories. The impact of flame-throwing tanks on the Japanese army was truly devastating. The soldiers, trained to stoically endure artillery shelling and airstrikes, were not psychologically prepared for the horror of being burned alive. This deep-seated fear led to the first mass surrender in the history of the Japanese armed forces. Lieutenant Yamada, one of the few surviving officers, later testified that it was the burning oil, not bullets or shrapnel, that finally broke the spirit of the Japanese army. After the end of World War II, the Marine Corps completely rebuilt its assault doctrine, basing it on the principles of combined arms cooperation, which proved their effectiveness in the battles for Iwo Jima. The M4, A3, and R3 Sherman flame-throwing tanks continued to serve in the Korean War, where they destroyed hundreds of fortified positions of North Korean and Chinese troops. Flame-throwing tanks have acquired a special symbolic significance in the military history of the United States. Visitors to military museums often pass by these exhibits with an uneasy feeling caused by the realization of their purpose. Veterans stop in front of them to remember those who fought and died, and to recognize the bitter necessity of the war. In 2015, the last official meeting of veterans of flame-throwing tank units took place, attended by only 3 surviving crew members, a silent testimony to the inexorable passage of time. The role of flame-throwing tanks in the battle for Iwo Jima cannot be overestimated. According to the unanimous opinion of military historians, they saved thousands of lives of American Marines, shortening the duration of the battle and minimizing losses during the assault on fortified positions. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, the last recipient of the Medal of Honor for his exploits on Iwo Jima, died at the age of 98, bringing with him vivid memories of those terrible days. The secret reports of Colonel Unmacked, declassified only recently, testified to the incredible speed of development and implementation of flame-throwing technologies made possible by the innovative thinking of American engineers and the courage of the crews. Japanese military archives captured after the surrender contain numerous references to the paralyzing fear that gripped soldiers at the sight of approaching liquid fire. Flame-throwing tanks effectively negated the tactical advantages provided by the carefully planned and built system of Japanese defensive structures. Neither concrete, nor steel, nor even deeply dug tunnels could provide reliable protection from these weapons, which penetrated into the most sheltered places and destroyed all living things. In one of his last messages to the Imperial headquarters, General Kuribayashi made a prophetic statement, predicting that future wars would belong to nations capable of quickly adapting and creating new forms of warfare. His foresight was fully confirmed. The technological innovations of the American army overcame the traditional tactics of the Japanese forces based on self-sacrifice and fanatical devotion. The surviving tankers of flame-throwing units after the war often experienced serious moral difficulties associated with realizing the nature of their actions during combat operations. At a reconciliation ceremony held in 1985 between American and Japanese veterans, it was recognized that war turns even the most ordinary people into monsters, forced to follow terrible orders for the survival of their comrades. The former enemies embraced in a gesture of mutual forgiveness, tacitly acknowledging the tragic necessity of what they had to do. The historical legacy of flame-throwing tanks is unique in that the era of their active combat use began and ended in the waters of the Pacific Ocean. A total of 8 modified Sherman tanks, turned into flamethrower carriers by a group of enthusiastic engineers, have managed to fundamentally change the nature of warfare and become a symbol of the technological superiority of the United States. In the end, victory was achieved thanks to an unsurpassed combination of industrial potential, engineering and tactical adaptability of the American armed forces. The effectiveness of flame-throwing tanks in combat conditions was truly impressive. According to conservative estimates, each such tank destroyed on average more than 100 fortified enemy firing points. In total, more than 6,000 Japanese soldiers died directly from the use of flamethrower weapons, which accounted for a significant part of the total losses of the Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima. The technological advantage provided by the introduction of these weapons was reflected not only in the number of enemies destroyed, but also, more importantly, in the thousands of American soldiers' lives saved. It is symbolic that the last working Sherman flame-throwing tank was dismantled in 1959, marking the end of the era of this specific weapon. Its components have been preserved at the National Museum of the Marine Corps as a reminder of the technological triumph that changed the course of the Pacific War. Today, museum visitors can see these silent testimonies of one of the most brutal and innovative campaigns in military history. Ultimately, the story of the flame-throwing tanks on Iwo Jima remains a vivid example of how a small group of talented engineers and brave soldiers were able to change the course of the war through innovative thinking and determination. This story serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, the capacity for creativity and adaptation can manifest itself in unexpected ways, creating new paths to victory and, ultimately, to peace.